Hello there, welcome to Off the Planet. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz Licciardello.
It is election week in America, Chaz. The excitement is palpable. If you're a Republican, they're going to take back the House. They're going to take back the Senate. They're going to take back America.
Yeah, they probably will.
All right, show's over.
But there are a few things to say, John. Come back. There's a few things to
what's
say.
interesting you at this stage?
Okay, all right. Okay, well, first of all, the first thing which is really interesting is just we've been talking for a few elections in a row now about polling. And but whether it's accurate or not, and we're going to get a real test of where mainstream media polling's at versus partisan media polling in this. And the reason why is because after the last few elections, a lot of the mainstream pollsters aren't doing it anymore. They're just fewer mainstream pollsters. And a lot of when you see the 538 averages these days and the Real Clear Politics averages, a lot of them are made up by partisan polls. And because they're the only ones who are polling. In particular, this is going to be a real test because in the state of Pennsylvania, the partisan pollsters have said one thing and the mainstream pollsters have said something entirely different, which is the mainstream pollsters have said that Fetterman is either tied or in the lead, and the partisan pollsters have said that Fetterman's going down big time, which is an interesting test. So Pennsylvania is going to be an interesting one to look at to see what it's a snapshot of our future, because increasingly what's happening is pollsters are just becoming more and more partisan. Simply because the mainstream pollsters, is just no point them doing it. It costs a lot of money. They have to call more people and they just get bagged out when something goes wrong and they get no benefit when something goes right.
And partisan polls are interesting because on the one hand, campaigns don't want to have inaccurate polls if they're making internal decisions about their campaign. What are the issues that we should be making ads about and what issues should we be talking about on the stump? But at the same time, partisan polls also, if they've got one that says that they're closing the gap or they're getting to be in front, they want to put that out there into the public because it juices support. Everyone wants to back a winner. People want to donate money to somebody who looks like they've got a good shot, or let's get this person over the line. So you have to be very, very cynical about the private partisan polls that get put out by super PACs or put out by campaigns. They've got an ulterior motive. But then again, media organisations always had an ulterior motive with putting out polls because they were trying to gin up the horse race and buy themselves a lead story.
Well, I'm not even talking about the private political party polls. I'm talking about things like, for instance, Robert Cayley, who we spoke to last week, who's clearly a Republican. Anyone who saw our interview is in no doubt that he's a Republican, but he also has special techniques that he polls with, which he won't tell us.
Special techniques which tend to overestimate, or not, well, sometimes overestimate Republican support, but other times it means he's picking up more Republicans who actually do vote, and so the whole shy Trump voter thing. So it's really hard to know without knowing the methodology behind some of these polls as to, are they just a stopped clock getting the time right once in an election cycle, or are they actually, picking up something that others are missing?
Well, this week is going to tell us a little bit about that. So that's something to look out for. Another thing, the legals. 2020 was all about the lawsuits. It's going to be even more so probably. If it's close, it's going to be even more so this time around, because what a lot of people don't realise is that until quite recently, Republicans weren't allowed to really take part in the mechanisms of an election because they had what they call a consent agreement with courts about racism, basically, from 40 years ago. They were restricted from being involved in elections. That was lifted about 4 or 5 years ago, and increasingly they're getting more and more involved now, and that means more and more lawsuits. So that's where we're at the moment. Not necessarily a problem, that's the way the system's meant to work, but as we've seen recently, it can be a problem.
Yeah, and it can also be a hell of a money spinner, and that's the thing that Donald Trump proved. First he monetised being a presidential candidate, then he monetised the presidency, then he monetised being a losing president, raising hundreds of millions of dollars for lawsuits, in some cases that were tossed out on day one, and he pocketed the money. A lot of Trumpy candidates, I expect, will be mounting all sorts of challenges which may go nowhere in the courts, but they may make themselves $50 million after their campaign is over to pay off some of their campaign debts or get ready for their next campaign. They can make money by being a sore loser. If you just walk away and say, that's it, I lost, I'm done, nothing to see here, democracy is fine, you're a loser with a debt. Rather than somebody who refuses to lose, who's paid off a couple of mortgages.
I guess the hope is rather than worrying about hopefully the courts will take care of the charlatans. They're down the track. Yeah. The question is, on the day of the election, people are going to have to make some snap calls about people who appear to be intimidating voters. Yeah. Remember back in 2008, there were concerns about Obama supporters, the new Black Panthers. Fox News went crazy about these guys in black berets with big rifles standing outside.
Look-alike.
Yeah, standing outside election booths. This year, it's appearing like it'll be stop the steal types. We don't know. We'll find out. But people are going to have to make calls on the fly, and that may affect the numbers on some people who vote and some people who don't.
Yeah. One of the things to look out for, I think, on the day itself, in terms of the discrepancy between the polls and the final results, historically, typically, when there is an undecided vote, it will break towards the challenger. So for the Democratic incumbents who are already on a knife edge and are worried about being able to hold on, particularly the likes of maybe Mark Kelly in Arizona, Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire, Raphael Warnock in Georgia, there could very well be a late rush towards the challenger in each of those cases as undecided voters essentially go for the challenger. That is the historical pattern, and we could well see that. Those races have already been closing in the last 3 weeks, and it could be that we're going to see 1 or 2 extra Republicans come over the top in those Senate races, and the same dynamic typically is seen in House races as well.
Talking about which, something else we need to look out for on the day. You remember the Red Mirage from 2020, the idea of on the night, Republicans would do better, and then as the mail-in votes came in, Democrats would do better. That's probably going to be even more the case in some states this particular year, in particular Pennsylvania, which has had over 1 million early votes already. I'll tell you the states. Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Ohio, Utah, and Georgia, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. They're the states. Those states don't allow counting of postal votes and early votes before the election date, right? Which means that they have to count afterwards, which means if there's millions of early votes, could take weeks to count all those votes.
Right, so it's going to be kind of the reverse to what we saw in the midterms of 2018. Democrats were expected to do really well. On the day, they didn't do so well. It was like they did well, but not nearly as well. It wasn't a blue wave. But then 2 weeks later, suddenly, that was a blue wave. That was 40 seats. Wow. Yeah. So this time you're saying it's going to look really good for Republicans by election night when we're next talking about it. But in the days and weeks ahead, it's not going to be quite as good. Democrats could come back in a couple of close contests.
Although I think that the distinction won't be quite as sharp as 2020 because Trump was actively discouraging people from doing mail-in votes, whereas now I don't think there's quite the same discouragement. But still, many more Democrats definitely do mail-in votes at the moment because of the events of 2020. So you can expect a blue shift as it goes on, especially in Pennsylvania. So look out for that one because that could be the key state in the Senate.
Yep.
Just quickly, some propositions that I'm looking at, which is like ballot questions, like referendums, basically. Marijuana legalization is on the ballot in Arkansas, Maryland, Missouri, North Dakota, and South Dakota.
Yep.
In Colorado, they've got Proposition 122, which is actually going to decriminalise the non-commercial use of psilocybin, magic mushrooms, mescaline, and a whole heap more. They call it natural medicine.
Yeah, sounds like Democrats will be taking them up on that after this election.
They may well. Kentucky has abortion on the ballot because they're trying to ban abortion in the legislature, but the Constitution in Kentucky may not allow them to ban it. So that's going to be a test there. California, Michigan, Vermont try and protect abortion regulations with propositions. Alabama, Louisiana, Oregon, Tennessee, and Vermont, wait for it, are all voting on slavery. Yeah. You might think that this is a bit late for that, but what a lot of people don't realise is that the 13th Amendment, quote, it says the US shall permit neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So we're talking about slavery for prisoners here.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of cases where prisoners work for $1 an hour or something like that.
Making licence plates for 2 cents each.
Totally. These states are trying to potentially outlaw that.
Yeah.
So that's on the ballot.
And it's in the states that have mass incarceration, states like Florida, it's a big money spinner for the corrections department to recoup the costs of having so many people in prison is by putting them to work.
Totally.
They have prison farms, all sorts of things. So a number of these prisons become almost self-sufficient in some ways.
And a lot of people don't realise that 20 states allow that to happen.
Yeah.
They basically have prisoner slavery. I'll skip past the rest of them. There's so many of these. I think the postmortems are going to be something that's going to begin on election day that we can look out for, assuming the Democrats don't do too well. As far as I can see, the major ones are there's a candidate selection issue about progressives versus moderates. That's a perennial postmortem when Democrats don't do well.
Yeah, so if Tim Ryan, a moderate, does well, may not win in Ohio, but may get very close to winning a Senate seat in Ohio, where he would not be expected to win, but Mandela Barnes or John Fetterman lose in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, respectively, then yes, that will fuel the Bernie Sanders type candidates not winning us elections in these battleground states where we really would have had a better shot with a much more moderate candidate.
Yeah, and I think actually that one of the big issues as well is going to be in postmortems, if there is a postmortem, is a cultural battle between, so to speak, the woke versus the non-woke, or in other words, the abortion policy versus the economy policy as well. There's a cultural issue within the Democrat Party, what they're focusing on. Because there is no doubt that the Democrats chose to go after white suburban women at the expense of potentially black and Latino voters.
Yeah.
And let's see what the numbers are for white suburban women and black and Latino voters after this election. Depending on how that goes, there might be a lot of infighting over that over the next little while with Democrats as well.
Yeah.
Also, one other thing, the tactics of Democrats that they, in particular New Hampshire, have a look what happens in New Hampshire, because if Maggie Hassan loses that race to Don Bolduc, who was an extremist, that is there at least partly because the Democrats sunk money into promoting him at the expense of the moderate alternative Republican. If he ends up winning, which he might, then there is going to be a lot of repercussions within the Democratic Party over that, I expect.
Yeah, and so many of these races are not just proxy battles between the progressive and moderate wings of the Democratic Party or the establishment and Trump wings of the Republican Party, but in many ways we're also seeing a little bit of a pre-season curtain raiser of the matchup between Trump and Biden, if it happens in 2024.
Yeah.
Interestingly, there seems to be more doubts about Joe Biden at the moment, whether he is going to run again and whether going into the minority on Capitol Hill will make the presidency seem a lot less inviting to him. Meanwhile, it sounds like Donald Trump is a week away from declaring that he's going to run again, possibly to try and sort of psych the Justice Department out of indicting him. But that is going to be an incredible campaign if we've got a leading Republican ex-president seeking to become president again, who is also potentially on his way to jail. That's going to be interesting. And on that, there's some fascinating data coming out now that a lot of Republicans are worrying about Donald Trump as their nominee in 2024. He still gets about half of their support, but increasingly, Ron DeSantis is emerging as a very strong rival to Donald Trump, not just in the national polls where it's often 50-30 Trump over DeSantis, but in some key states. I noticed Trump is only leading DeSantis by 7 points in Nevada. In Georgia, Ron DeSantis is leading Donald Trump by 52-36. So we could be in a situation a little bit like 2008. Rudy Giuliani was the national frontrunner to be the Republican nominee heading into the 2008 primaries. Name recognition, everyone knew who he was. He couldn't win a state. And other candidates did better when they actually got to the state-by-state primaries and caucuses. We could be looking at something similar with Donald Trump. Name recognition makes him a front-runner early, but the state polls will tell a very different story. That's how it's shaping up right now.
They're certainly sniping at each other already, Trump and DeSantis. In particular, there's a moderate in Colorado, which we should definitely pay attention to how he goes. His name's Joe O'Dea, a moderate Republican, who, if he goes well, that will help Ron DeSantis a bit because Trump basically disassociated himself. Not just disassociated, he actually went Joe O'Dea. He bashed him on Truth Social because Joe O'Dea said he didn't think Trump should run again. Ron DeSantis endorsed him and recorded an ad for him, and Trump's been sniping at Ron DeSantis on Truth Social over that. So if this guy ends up going okay, that's going to be a point of contention.
We're short on time today. Yeah. You flagged in the show, though, you wanted to talk about Paul Pelosi. What have you got on?
Okay, just very, very quickly. Firstly, you talked about a Trump with the conspiracy theories. I think he's the least of our worries at the moment with Paul Pelosi because he's actually following the curve on conspiracy theories. He was like 4 days behind everyone else. Right now, we're at the stage where there are people blaming the victim, in this case, Paul Pelosi. Just have a listen to Marjorie Taylor Greene.
where Americans are robbed, stabbed, raped, kidnapped, carjacked, and murdered. But the only crime victim you hear about from Democrats in the media is Paul Pelosi. Paul Pelosi was brutally attacked by a drugged-out illegal alien that should have been deported, and Paul Pelosi should have been a gun owner and shot his attacker.
So leaving aside the fact that he should have woken up in his sleep and shot the intruder, according to Marjorie Taylor Greene, on the conspiracy thing. Now, I hate the conspiracies, you know that well, but it doesn't help when the mainstream media helps spread conspiracies with their behaviour. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. NBC ran a news report a couple of days ago. This was it.
After a knock and announce, the front door was opened by Mr. Pelosi. The 82-year-old did not immediately declare an emergency or try to leave his home, but instead began walking several feet back into the foyer toward the assailant and away from police. It's unclear if the 82-year-old was already injured or what his mental state was, say sources. According to court documents, when the officer asked what was going on, defendant smiled and said everything's good. But instantaneously, a struggle ensued as police clearly saw David DePape strike Paul Pelosi in the head with a hammer.
Now that's odd behaviour from Paul Pelosi that they're describing there. I don't care about it. The details will come out in the trial. Okay, I'm not on the conspiracy train. But what is important is that they then pulled that report, NBC, a couple of hours later, and they said, quote, they deleted it off the internet, apart from the copy I've got there, and they said, quote, the piece should not have aired because it did not meet NBC News reporting standards. They didn't say why. They didn't say what was accurate or inaccurate. They just said that. Now that is terrible because if you don't give any more information, that helps the conspiracists scream cover up. And every single statement in that report starts going, oh, they're trying to hide that, they're trying to hide that. And that just really gives them a breath of fresh air, the conspiracists, and a second wind, which they have run with, let me tell you. And on that note, probably the biggest example of this, in my view, is the body cam footage, where, now I understand why they're not showing the body cam footage. They've got body cam footage. Apparently, according to the San Francisco DA, it actually shows that it actually shows the bit where he was struck with a hammer. It actually shows the body cam footage actually shows the actual attack. But they're not showing it. They say, quote, there are no plans to release the body cam footage prior to court proceedings. Now, I understand maybe they go, okay, well, that's not going to help us in court. But if there's conspiracy theories all over the place, surely you've got to try and cut down on them by releasing, at least having some kind of transparency, because I know it's not going to shut them up. But there are people on the boundary who might be receptive to conspiracy theories who wouldn't be if they could see the footage. What do you think?
It's not the FBI's job or the District Attorney's job to disavow people of conspiracy theories. They're about getting a successful prosecution in the Paul Pelosi case. The man's been hit in the head with a hammer. They've got a suspect who they've got very strong evidence against. They'll proceed with that prosecution. That's their priority. Wingnuts on the internet don't matter as far as that's concerned. It matters in terms of the election and our society, sure. But I also take the view of there is no convincing people with facts. If you show body cam footage, they'll say, well, it's clearly a fake as well. Their excuses will shift with new information like Quicksilver. It reminds me of my favourite quote from the comedian George Carlin, who said, never argue with an idiot because they'll drag you down to their level and beat you on experience. It's the same with these conspiracy theories. You can't beat them. They will change their facts to fit what is their preconceived preferred narrative, that this isn't simply a case of an 82-year-old husband of the Speaker of the House of Representatives being hit in the head in a political attack or motivated by mental illness or whatever we find out in the court case itself. We'll find out the facts. They won't believe the facts, and frankly, they can go suit themselves.
I mean, it's hard to argue with the fact that you're not going to convince like the hardcore conspiracy theorists. I agree with that. But what I would say to you is if we care about the victims, in this case Paul Pelosi, but you know there are others and other examples, the difference between conspiracy theory that's the size of X and the conspiracy theory that's the size of X on 4 or X on 10 is significant. Ask the parents of, was that guy Seth, the guy who was killed? Seth Rich, yeah, the guy who was killed back in 2016, and his parents were hounded by conspiracy theories for months, for years afterwards. If that conspiracy theory was half as big, that would have made their lives infinitely better. Yeah. And I think if we can reduce the size of them, then that's a good thing.
Sure, yeah. So you take Alex Jones to court over the Sandy Hook denialism. But that doesn't change people's minds. It maybe punishes Alex Jones if he doesn't duck out of it through bankruptcy laws. But look, at the end of the day, people want to believe that Elvis is alive, 9/11 was an inside job, and Sandy Hook didn't happen. They're going to believe that, and you're not going to change their mind.
Okay, and just one other thing on the Pelosi thing. The issue of threats against politicians is a very serious issue. I think it's been underplayed until now. I'm glad it's getting some attention. Like the numbers from 2017 to 2021, the Capitol Police say it's gone from 3,939 threats against politicians to 9,625 threats. Okay, it's a lot of threats. Okay, but that's exactly why it annoys me when this issue comes out and politicians exploit it for political purposes. Now, on the show, I was a little bit ambivalent about Biden with his speech. I thought that he could have been a lot more exploitative than he was, so I was grateful for that. But just linking the Paul Pelosi thing to the democracy thing, I would have preferred him to keep it separate personally. But he's not the one I'm angry with. The first person I'm angry with is John Fetterman, who literally the day after the Paul Pelosi thing ran this tweet here, where he showed this burning sign and said, "This happened last night on a farm in deep red Lawrence County. There is no place of violence and intimidation in politics. Our campaign is about bringing people together and rejecting hate and extremism." And then straight after that, he then said, "If you agree, please consider chipping in a few dollars today." Now, he's showing a half-burning sign, which to me looks set up, to be honest. It's in the middle of a farm. That sign would have burnt for about 3 seconds. How'd they get the photo? But even if it wasn't set up, even if it was real, then you go, okay, don't equate a burning sign with someone who's had their head bashed in, and then ask for money as a result of it. I just feel like the cynicism we need to take this issue as seriously as possible because it's a real issue and it could be a real problem for democracy going forward.
Sure.
I feel so. That's one example. Yeah. And the other example is from the right. Is the other night, Don Bolduc, who is the extremist I was saying from New Hampshire, before a debate, they said he was attacked by a protester, and the right went crazy. They immediately speculated he was a Democrat. And Seb Gorka here, this is an example of a tweet. So when will the Democrats be blamed for this? Lots of, why won't the Democrats condemn this? Okay, number one, the guy's a libertarian who attacked him. But number two, look at the footage. Here is the footage of the attack. Have a look right now. As you can see, the guy with we've put arrows on him, the guy with the goatee and the camera is the guy who supposedly attacked Don Bolduc. He didn't touch him. Look at another angle. He didn't touch him. Have a look at the slow-mo. It's pretty obvious his hand is behind his back. He didn't touch him, but Don Bolduc is saying he hit me, and now people are exploiting it clearly to make a political point, and that cheapens the whole issue, which means that we have our little argument, we all feel good about ourselves, and then in a month's time, it happens again, and then it happens again, and it gets sucked into the political maelstrom. No one solves it. And the whole of democracy becomes worse off because of it. Sorry, I've talked for a long time.
We're getting old and jaded, aren't we? All right then, now we've still got a few things to get through. We did promise in the show more from our interview with economist and former Obama Labor Department advisor Betsey Stevenson, talking about the US economy as it is currently, but also the political implications, what should have been done, what's going to happen next. Here's Betsey. Betsey Stevenson, welcome back to Planet America.
Thank you. It's nice to see you again.
Betsey, could you sum up for us the state of the American economy right now, in your view, and also the impact that high inflation is having in particular on ordinary Americans?
Well, it's interesting that you started by asking me about the state of the economy, and then you went straight to inflation. Because there's two things going on in the economy right now, which kind of means that there's a fantastic story to tell and a negative story. And you pivoted to the negative story, that's inflation. I'm going to start with a fantastic story, which is the United States has enormous job growth going on right now. We have more job openings we've ever had before. And for ordinary people, a job opening is an opportunity to do something you like better, an opportunity to get a higher wage. And what we've seen is one of the fastest recoveries we've ever seen from a recession, certainly the fastest recovery from a recession this deep. If you look at labor force participation, it's almost completely recovered. So all those fears people had that paying people to stay home, a lot of unemployment insurance, a lot of benefits, we're going to keep people out of the labor force. That's false. People are back, baby. Like, they are working, they're taking the jobs. So that's the good side of the story. We had a very fast economic recovery. We got everybody sort of back in jobs. A lot of people are making more money in inflation adjusted terms than they were before. What about the downside? Well, the downside is that not everybody's making more money in inflation adjusted terms than they were before. And some people are facing higher prices and their wages aren't keeping up and they're struggling to make ends meet and they're frustrated by the fact that it feels like every time you turn around, the prices are going up. So that's definitely part of the story of this current economy is, it's much higher inflation. And I think if you're, a central banker trying to figure out like how much inflation is the right amount of inflation, I think the answer is the kind of inflation people don't notice is the right amount of inflation. And certainly that's not where we're at today.
Betsy, the entire world's suffering from inflation at the moment, but outside of Europe, which has huge energy prices at the moment because of the Ukraine war, most of the rest of the world has lower inflation rates than America does. So how much of America's inflation rate is the fault of the Biden administration, do you think?
Well, I just feel like you excluded some of the most important comparison countries. Like, let's exclude the UK, which has higher inflation, or other parts of Europe. I think trying to parse this out and decide, how much of this is, due to administration policies is kind of hard for two reasons. It's hard because, we're sort of splitting hairs because, as you said, the whole globe is facing high inflation. And so, it's like, did we get a 0.5 percentage point more than we would have if we hadn't had some Biden policy is really the question that you're asking me. But the reason I find that question really hard to answer is because all those policies that weren't just Biden's policies, Trump era policies, Biden era policies, Congress signed these policies that put money in households' pockets. They led to the fastest recovery, that we could have imagined. Really the fastest recovery we could have imagined. It put everybody back in jobs. It prevented the kind of deterioration in dissociation from work that happened in the 2008 recession, where there were people, a decade later that just hadn't gone back to work. So, what did giving people all that money do? It meant that demand recovered faster than supply. And that's the simple explanation for what's going on with inflation. And really what's going on in inflation around the globe is that people's desire to buy stuff rose faster, recovered faster than our ability to make stuff or provide services. And so the result is higher prices because there's too many people chasing, not enough goods and services for sale. So sure, if we hadn't given households as much money, there wouldn't be, they would have lower demand, right? If people couldn't afford to buy food, they wouldn't buy food and there wouldn't be as much demand for food. But it's not clear to me if we look at take a broader perspective that we would have been better off if we had, say, not had the child tax credit and, led to, more family suffering. So that's why I think it's really hard to put this towards any particular policy and say that there was a mistake. That's not to say that the Fed doesn't have to raise rates and we don't have to deal with inflation now, but I think the jury's still out. And my guess is if you look back 10 years from now, you're going to say everything we did to get people back to work quickly saved economies, not just in the United States, but in a lot of countries.
So, Betsy, even if we accept that the Biden administration didn't necessarily cause the inflation problem at the moment, could they have done more to try and cure it? And not just make life easier for ordinary Americans, but also make things politically easier for them. It's looking like a tough week.
I mean, I'm going to say that I think that, as you noted, the whole globe is facing high inflation. And a high inflationary environment is bad for whoever is the incumbent in office, regardless of the political party or the choices they made. And I think if you look at some of the elections we've seen since inflation started picking up, you'll see that pattern. That's not good for an incumbent when we have inflation. People really hate it. They like to blame whoever's in office, and they want to hope that the next guy is going to have a better solution. The truth is, like, the Republicans who are going to take seats, don't get me wrong, they are going to win elections over this inflation issue, but I don't think they're going to solve the inflation problem. And I think that there's not much that the Biden administration or Democrats in Congress could have done to put us in a good enough situation regarding inflation that they wouldn't have faced this problem at the polls. So that's sort of my point, is like, sure, they could have given out a little bit less money with, say, the American Rescue Plan. They could have not done, they did payments to everybody. It's called the economic impact payments or stimulus payments. Maybe they should have only targeted the households who really needed it. That might have chilled inflation a little bit. Perhaps they could have not given student loan forgiveness, and that might have chilled inflation a little bit, but that also comes at a political cost. So it's not clear to me any of the things they could have done to put us in a situation right now where we might have a little bit lower inflation would have done them any good at the polls.
Now, to approach from a different angle, inflation rates have seemed to have topped out. To approach from a different angle, inflation rates do seem to have topped out at the very least. But at the same time as that, job openings are high, but they're trending down a bit. The money supply is trending down a bit. Personal savings trending down a bit. Despite all that, the Federal Reserve is still hiking interest rates quite rapidly, even though we don't know yet the full effects of the previous interest rate hikes that they instituted. So, are they going too hard? And is America potentially heading towards a nasty recession because of it?
You know, we're only going to know the answer to that question, obviously, in a year. What do I think looking at it right now? You know, I think that they've got to make sure that people don't adjust their inflation expectations to sort of expect ongoing inflation of, 4 to 5%. And that's the challenge, is inflation is coming down, but we don't really want it to get stuck around 4 or 5%. And if it really becomes entrenched at that level, it could become really hard to bring down. So I think what they believe, and I think this is right, is if they overshoot a little bit and they start to see the economy cooling too much, they think they can easily put their foot back on the gas and fix that problem very quickly, and that they can fix that problem more quickly than they can fix the reverse problem, which is not bringing inflation down quickly enough and letting higher rates of inflation get sort of embedded into our national psyche in a way that makes it hard for them to convince us that inflation will come back down to 2%. I think that they're, the rate rises we've seen so far, you're right to say that they haven't fully percolated through, but it does look like they are having an effect. So they are moving through. I think that we're going to see rates go a little bit higher. I think that that's going to be necessary, because what's happening is Americans are seeing the prices going up, but they're looking at the fact that their bank accounts are still kind of flush from everything they accumulated over the pandemic, and they're paying the high prices because they want to do the thing they want to do, right? Leisure travel is up above 2019 levels. People want to go on vacation. They want to see the relatives they haven't seen in a while, and they're willing to pay through the nose. And as long as people are willing to pay through the nose, the Fed's going to have to work a little bit harder to convince them, it's time to leave your money in the bank.
Betsy, I wonder, what are the economic risks that you see in the likely takeover of Republicans in the House and possibly the Senate as well? It feels like we're probably soon going to be talking about debt limits and government shutdowns and the associated economic risks that come with that sort of instability.
Well, we're definitely going to be having those conversations. The debt ceiling, we're going to be approaching that sort of early 2023, probably, end 2022, that this December, where they're going to start sounding the alarms and they're going to start having those debates. And if Republicans have taken the House and the Senate, they are definitely going to try to extract a concession to raise the debt ceiling. And that is just political fire every single time. And you talk about the Fed raising rates. defaulting on the debt, that's one way to raise rates too. People are going to demand much higher risk premiums. So the more they play with that fire, the more they will also be, leading to people to not want to hold U.S. government debt, putting upward pressure on rates, and potentially cooling the economy. So I hate those games, but they're definitely going to happen. The threat of a government shutdown is going to happen. What you're probably going to get is, they won't pass a new budget. They'll do this kind of continuing resolution, which will eventually keep the government running, but it won't allow us to do sort of any new things because we won't be having a new budget. We'll just be continuing the old budget. So you can keep on keeping on, but nothing new. I think that means that it's going to be sort of a drag over the next 2 years, and we're not going to see a lot of innovative stuff done by government. And that'll be okay as long as the economy is okay. So if the economy goes into recession, we're going to need some innovative approaches when the Fed's got their foot on the brake and the economy's going into recession and prices haven't come all the way down. We're going to need really targeted help for American households. And I'm not sure Congress is going to be able to deliver that. So I think that's what, we could see happen. And I think when you can't deliver that targeted help, I think what you end up with is a situation not just where there's a lot of suffering, but also the recession tends to go deeper and last longer than it otherwise would.
Betsey, my last question is, I guess, very big picture, zooming out a little bit from the sort of economic impact of this particular pandemic. There were, in retrospect, a lot of big structural changes that happened after the global financial crisis. Some industries became more efficient, some went away altogether. What do you think the economic legacy of the pandemic period is going to be?
Well, one of the things we're seeing in the US right now is productivity has declined. And I think we're trying to figure out what's going on with productivity. Where are the gains and where are they going to be lasting and where did we get harmed? And I think that's what's really interesting. One analysis that some scholars did looking at productivity that was presented at the Fed's Jackson Hole conference this year found productivity gains in people who work from home, but of course productivity losses in people who had to work with people because we had to take all sorts of precautions. So, if instead of spending all your time preparing food and waiting tables, you're now also spending a lot more time cleaning and sanitizing, you just can't make as much food or serve as many tables. That's a productivity decline. What we saw in people who could work from home is it just amazing use of technology to be able to be more productive in their jobs. And I think as we move forward, what we're going to see is we had a great movement forward in being able to use technology effectively to be more productive. And I think that's going to stick. I think there's a lot of upsides to that. I do worry a little bit about how that might entrench inequality because again, whenever we see gaps in sort of some workers have become more productive, workers with more education or more tools or more use of technology, leaving other workers behind, well, that can lead to wage and income gaps that are destabilizing for society. So the good news is I think when we get past the chaos of right now where people are still kind of sick, we're still seeing the people missing work due to childcare issues, due to illness. We're still seeing the productivity losses from those things as well as from the way in which we have to adapt to make sure that there's less contagion. I think those will eventually sort themselves out and we'll be left with the productivity gains from the way in which we all learn to use technology more efficiently. I also am optimistic that we maybe in America, and this I'm going to say to Australians, one of the things you might not know is Americans don't take any vacation. We work really long hours. We're one of the only advanced countries in the world with no guaranteed annual leave, paternal leave, maternal leave, any kind of parental leave, sick leave. We just don't get any leave. And I think people have started to push back on that. And so that's the other thing I'm kind of optimistic about is maybe Americans will start taking vacations.
Now, I've heard a lot about petrol prices recently, although I'm unsure how much government policy actually affects them. So if Trump was still president and doing Trumpy things, how much different would the petrol price be right now, do you think?
Well, first of all, you must find it really funny to look at Americans like losing their mind over like $4.50 a gallon gas, because that's not really expensive for a lot of other countries. And it's because in a lot of other countries, government actually already does things to raise the price of gas through like, gas taxes and fuel fees and things that sort of incorporate the fact that when you fill your tank with gas, you're going to get on the roads and the roads need repair. Americans government doesn't do much to increase the price of gas. Taxes on gas are extremely low, which means on the flip side that in a time like right now, there's not much the government can do. Like I guess they could start subsidizing gas purchases, but I mean, aside from that, there's not that much they can do to bring down the price of gas, right? We're seeing the fluctuations that occur in the world market when we're paying one of the lowest prices in the world to fuel our cars. We notice those global ups and downs, I think, a little bit more than in countries where there are other fees associated with gas that mean that you're starting from a different baseline. So I think that, there's nothing that would have happened differently if Trump had been president.
Finally, what do you think has been the Biden administration's biggest economic mistake? And what do you think has been their most underrated move?
Oof. So, I think the biggest mistake, honestly, was, not dealing with the student loan issue earlier. They let the moratorium on paying back your student loans go on longer than it should have. We were already seeing inflation. So we knew that it was time to stop handing out money. And the one group of people we were still handing out money to were people who were holding on to student loans because we weren't asking them to go back to paying their loans. They hadn't had to pay their loans since the pandemic began. So I think they should have, in fact, they haven't even started repaying their loans. They start at the end of this year. So I think that's the biggest mistake. They should have gotten people back to paying their student loans earlier. I think the most underrated thing the Biden administration did was the American Rescue Plan. I do think that it's been wildly criticized. It's been blamed for inflation. And I think the reality is we see record unemployment, not just for college graduates, but for high school graduates. And if you go back to the 2008 recession, it took nearly a decade to get unemployment down that low for our least educated workers. And here we did it, in 2 years, or 2.5 years. So a really remarkable pace of recovery. And we've gotten most of these people back into the labor force. So labor force participation among sort of middle-aged adults, sort of in the 20s through the 50s, is sort of back. I think, one of the places where we're still struggling, and I think a lot of people around the globe are struggling, is older workers really, stepped out of the labor force, I think, due to fears of COVID and haven't come back. But I think a lot of that recovery is due to the American Rescue Plan, and I think it's underrated.
Betsey Stevenson, we thank you for your insights and appreciate your time.
Good to talk to you.
Now, before we go, some malarkey.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
This advertisement may look like some kind of, crazy, ridiculous Onion satire or something, but it is all too serious. Calling out racism against white people. Now, that is the work of Trump advisor and speechwriter Stephen Miller, and it is worth doing a quick bit of fact-checking on that first. The ad claims Joe Biden put white people last in line for COVID relief funds. Now, that refers to Biden's Small Business Administration giving priority to applications by bars and restaurants for just a 3-week period in 2021 if that business was at least 51% owned by women, veterans, and those deemed socially and economically disadvantaged. So the claim is factually incorrect, given that there are white women, white veterans, and white people who are socially and economically disadvantaged. But even so, when it was challenged by conservative groups in a federal court, it was scrapped. That priority system went away, so it never happened. Now, Did Kamala Harris say that disaster aid should go to non-white citizens first? Well, not really, no. Chaz, of course, you debunked this a couple of weeks ago. It was a long, complicated answer from Kamala Harris to a long, complicated question about the impacts of climate change being unequal and that poorer nations and indeed poorer Americans are paying a higher price. She actually said sometimes we have to take into account those disparities with the goal of equitable priorities. Now, whatever she actually meant, those comments were taken out of context and interpreted in a way that Harris says she did not mean, but it was such a jumble, it's hard to disprove.
And importantly, she wasn't talking about disaster aid at all.
Right.
That's the important point.
It was about climate change and the effects of it. Now, do Liberal politicians block access to medicine based on skin colour? Apparently this refers to a policy from New York State health authorities, which says that whenever there is a shortage of monoclonal antibodies or antivirals to treat COVID patients, the drugs should be prioritised for patients with the highest risk of hospitalisation or death. It adds, non-white race or Hispanic Latino ethnicity should be considered a risk factor because they have an increased risk of severe illness and death from COVID-19. Now, by the way, the CDC under President Trump agreed that ethnicity was a risk factor. But the bottom line in this is it's not up to politicians to decide. It is the doctors who decide who gets drugs if supplies are limited. Ethnicity is known to be a risk factor alongside age, underlying health conditions, obesity and so on. So you may as well be complaining at this point that fat white smokers are being given the drugs first. Yeah, in some cases they are, but you're missing the point. They want people to stop dying and you start with those at highest risk. Yeah. Makes sense. Now, finally, do progressive organisations like airlines, universities, all openly discriminate against white Americans? Well, no, although some discriminate in favour of those from disadvantaged backgrounds, including minority groups and even majority groups like women, for instance. They make those decisions in employment and admissions. The constitutionality, though, of affirmative action policies are now under consideration by the US Supreme Court at the moment. So whether they even survive that case or not, affirmative action, like those other comments and policies, are all about recognising there is existing inequality and vulnerability as a result of disadvantage and discrimination. They're just trying to redress that imbalance. But clearly a large number of white Americans feel they are losing what they see as a zero-sum game.
Can I tell you what the funniest thing about that flyer is?
Do tell me.
There's also a flyer going out from the same group to Asian people where it makes exactly the same claims about white bigotry, bigotry against white people, except for at the top there it says discrimination against white and Asian Americans, and then all the examples are about white people. Like, there's just so blatant and cynical, and I don't think we should be taking that seriously.
No. Okay, now, we had some more of our conversation with former Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp of the state of North Dakota, a moderate Democrat, so kind of more in line with, say, Joe Biden than Bernie Sanders. She had some very interesting things to say about how this campaign has been run, whether it will be won, and what will happen next for Joe Biden, Donald Trump and Democrats generally. More from Heidi Heitkamp. Senator, polls consistently show that voters this year are concerned about inflation and the economy and issues like crime. Democrats have been focusing throughout on abortion and more recently on saving democracy. Now that seems to be a fundamental miscalculation of what this election is all about, but there must be more to it than that.
I only laugh because I coach so well. I do a fair amount of television here in national television, both on cable and the network. And I started this drumbeat a year ago. Said you need an economic message. You need an economic message. You need an economic message. You need to talk about it, quit ignoring inflation. And I think in part what happened when inflation hit in this country, many of the presidential advisors said it was transitory, right? Oh, this is going to wash out when supply chains realign after COVID. This is simply a post-COVID kind of hangover. We'll get there. And actually, Democratic economic experts like Larry Summers and Jason Furman, who actually both served in the Obama administration, were waving their hands and jumping up and down and saying, pay attention, pay attention. But, Democrats are never good at messaging. They're never good at economic messaging. And, it's a fault that they have to correct, because our message on what we've done to improve the economy is so much stronger than the Republican message. I was in Las Vegas yesterday, and I got into a car with a driver, and I started talking to him, and he just started blasting. I ask everybody about politics, and they're taught not to do that, but I tell them I'll never tell on them. And here I am, but no one down there is going to know this car service, right? Anyway, so he started blasting away at the Democrats, and I just kind of took him through the numbers. He said, well, Trump was so much better for the economy. I said, Trump had almost a year of negative economic growth. I said, I don't blame him for the pandemic, but comparisons are really pretty good for the Democrats. This problem started when we didn't talk about Trump's failed ability to deliver a robust economy. He never really had as large a GDP growth as what he promised. He saw a lot of unemployment, especially in the last couple months or a year of his term. And we didn't bring back manufacturing jobs. In fact, Joe Biden's brought back many more manufacturing jobs than Donald Trump has. And so when you look at Tim Ryan, who really is running on those bread and butter issues, really running on, as my friend Barbara Mikulski used to say, it's all good to talk about the macroeconomic issues, but the Democrats win when we talk about the macaroni and cheese issues. Guess what? We haven't talked about the macaroni and cheese issues, and that's very problematic, because now we're playing catch up, and it's probably for many of our candidates too little too late.
Now, someone like Tim Ryan would generally be considered a stronger candidate than the Democrat who's running for governor in Ohio. Does the Senate race affect the governor race or vice versa, or are the two of them basically independent of each other?
This is such an interesting thing to watch. We will have, if the Democrats don't have a horrible night, we will have places where we will elect Republican governors or Democratic governors and Republican senators. That's the first time in a long time. I think there's a lot of analysis whether our candidate, who I love, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, can Warnock win if she loses? Well, the answer is yes, I think he can. Can Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire win if the governor is a Republican? The answer is yes, and she has. We have this problem in Arizona where we have I don't want to put down anyone, but she's not a very strong candidate for governor, our Democratic candidate. And how will that affect Mark Kelly's race? And so this is really something to watch. These divisions between Senate and governor. Florida is another place where you have to look at. DeSantis is fairly strong against Charlie Crist. Can Val Demings, our candidate, overcome that spread when she's trying to unseat Marco Rubio? And so what I'm hoping is that we're going to see some ticket splitting, because I think that's good for our country. I don't think straight party ticket voting is good for our country. And you can say, well, in other places, but I would say in other places you have a much more robust party system. You don't just have a two-party system.
Heidi, it feels like Democrats have become non-competitive in a number of states where only 2 or 4 years ago they were very competitive in, like, for instance, your state, North Dakota. But even now, Ohio and Florida are rapidly becoming red. Is this a messaging issue from the Democrats, or is it an organizational issue, or something else?
No, I mean, first off, let's evaluate. We're seeing people voting in record numbers that have never voted before. The disaffected tend to, if they've never voted, usually they're angry when they come to the polls. There's something has motivated them, and President Trump has been a great motivator to bring people who've never voted before to the polls. I think the celebrity, and to give him his due, people always say, well, he's genuine. You know exactly who he is. And I said, yeah, you do know who he is. He tells you every day who he is. I don't know why you like him or want to vote for him after he's told you who he is. But there's an attraction to that. And so we're bringing more people to the polls. The Democrats have not paid enough attention to our traditional base, which is elderly and and working folks. When I started out in politics, that's who I could count on, and small farmers. We've lost those people, and we've lost those people because we don't have a message that they see us as the party of coastal elites. We don't care about anyone else, but what happens in bathrooms in high schools, and we really have failed, I think. My dad was a guy, when I would come home and complain that life wasn't fair, he would just laugh and say, well, the rules, go out and win. And the Democrats can sit around and wring their hands about, Rupert Murdoch and Fox News and how unfair this is and what a great job they're doing. But if people don't believe they're doing a good job, whose fault is that? And so there's going to have to be some soul searching, not just, if we survive in the Senate, but they take the House, we still have to do some soul searching. We have to do everything that we can to protect this democracy, because I think that is what's on the ballot. And I think that we have not effectively been, good messengers of what is the positive things. It's so much easier, and I'm sure that's true globally, to sell hate and disunity than it is to sell inspiration and good ideas. And so how do we overcome that? I think that's really the soul searching that needs to come. But obviously, it's going to be overshadowed by discussions about whether Joe Biden should run again, discussions about who should replace Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee if he decides not to run again. And, how does a minority in both the House and the Senate, or in the Senate or in the House, how do they message effectively to really inspire, not just scare, but also inspire voters to vote for the Democrats?
I wonder, Senator, is there any doubt in your mind that Donald Trump is off and running again rather than just teasing another White House run? And if he were to win the White House again, how concerned would you be about that?
He's going to run. I've always said that, though. So this latest, kind of movement that he has made to begin to reorganize campaigns and to be out there. He's out there campaigning right now. He is going to run. And I think he sees it as survival, because if he runs and if he wins, he thinks that the Department of Justice will have to do something different with the numerous grand juries that are out there on his behavior, investigating his behavior. He's got huge problems in New York, not only personally, but with defamation lawsuits, but he's got huge problems for his corporation. And I think he sees this as literally the get out of jail free card. And so I think he clearly is going to run. He loves that audience. He loves the attention. And he quite honestly thinks that the people who have suggested that they might run are disloyal. And he wants to, prove his point to them. So it's not just about, these other issues, his personal issues. It's about socking it to DeSantis and to Mike Pence and people who have suggested that they might be better nominees.
Heidi, leaving aside what will happen over the next 2 years, what do you think is the issue that most needs to be addressed over the next 2 years?
Boy, that's a good question. I have so many. I think the economic future of our country, and that's a big ball. Everybody is looking at inflation. Inflation is going to, we're going to see year over year inflation come down. We still will have prices that were much higher than they were before the pandemic and during the pandemic, because I don't think anyone's going to cut their prices. But I think the rate of growth of inflation will be reduced. And I think that we have to pay attention to income inequality and people getting richer and our dwindling middle class. I asked this question of a driver in Philly. It was really interesting because, his experience is completely different than mine. He lives in Philly, grew up in Philly, and he said education and gun violence. When I asked him, I said, what do you want us to do? What do you want people who are working? And for him, that was what curtailed his future. And that's what he worries about with his kids. is gun violence and that the education system isn't good. And so I think that when you look at all the issues, whether it's immigration, whether it is gun violence, whether it's education, it really goes to economic opportunity. And I know that that's kind of a cop-out answer. I think you have to start putting all of these important issues into the bundle of our economic future in this country. And I'll tell you what, our economic future, every time we've had periods of rapid growth where the American experiment works, is when everybody is able to effectively participate in our economy. And I think this income inequality, people being left behind, is one of the most dangerous things for the progression of this American ideal.
Finally, Senator, you voted in favour of one of Donald Trump's Supreme Court nominees in Neil Gorsuch. You voted against another nominee in Brett Kavanaugh. Earlier this year, you saw both of them vote to successfully overturn Roe versus Wade's protections of abortion rights in America. How did that make you feel?
Now, my reaction was completely predictable. Not to defend my vote for Judge Gorsuch, that vote was complicated because Judge Gorsuch has been a rare proponent of Indigenous rights in our country and on the court, and in fact issued a landmark decision that was quickly reversed when the majority changed. So there's more than just abortion rights for me. Yes, they're important, but he also was Scalia's replacement. He wasn't going to flip the court. People said, "Oh, did you feel like you were fooled?" I said, I never believed them when they said, "Oh, well, and longstanding precedent won't change." Oh, yeah, well, it always does. And it does based on your political philosophy. I think what's really interesting is when you look at the makeup of the court is heavily Catholic. And I think that is something that people are looking at in terms of what motivated a lot of these decisions. When I was being asked to consider the Republican nominee, it was in the White House, and I walked out and I was with Mark Short, who at the time was the legislative director for the president, now kind of well known in this country because he has been a witness in the January 6th committee. So, and I consider Mark a friend. We worked on a couple of economic issues together. And Don McGahn, who at the time was the president's counsel. And I looked at him, I said, if you reverse Roe v. Wade, it will be a huge mistake for the Republican Party. And I don't think they believed it because for years they won elections with a pro-life platform, but people weren't motivated to worry about that because they had a constitutional right. That motivation now is the intensity on the reproductive right side of this issue is much higher than it's ever been because people know now this was a right that was taken away, and it was taken away by Republican nominees.
Senator Heidi Heitkamp, thank you for being with us on Planet America.
Well, thank you. It's always fun to be with you guys.
Former Senator Heidi Heitkamp joining us on Planet America this week. Chaz, we're just about out of time for Off the Planet. Any final comments, thoughts, or observations, or predictions? You're going to make any more predictions?
Oh, I think I've made enough stupid predictions that I'm going to regret in a few days' time.
Well, I've got a prediction.
Yeah?
It's the end of the show.
He's right.